Great. My name is Charles Briggs. I'm very pleased to be able to moderate this session, which is entitled, How Can Health Journalism Inform Media Studies and Linguistic Perspectives on the News? I've been asked to request that you silence your cell phones so that we don't have nice acoustic accompaniments to the talks. And so we'll again have we'll have 3 papers that are 30 minutes long, and then with plenty of time for questions at the end. Don't worry, hang on, there will be lunch provided for everyone. You will need some sustenance at that point. Michael Schudson is professor of journalism at Columbia University. He is the author of 7 books and co-editor of 3 others. At least if we haven't missed any, he seems to put them out with great frequency, so we might not have an accurate count there. Co-editor of 3 others concerning the history and sociology of the American news media, advertising, popular culture, Watergate, cultural memory, and other issues. Among his books are The Rise of the Right to Know, Politics and the Culture of Transparency, 1945 to 75. He is a recipient of many honors, been a Guggenheim Fellow, Center at the Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellow. Nice to be sitting next to one of them. I'm hoping some of it will rub off. Schudson's articles have appeared in the Columbia Journalism Review, Wilson Quarterly, and the American Prospect, and he has published many op-eds in leading newspapers. Julia Sonnevend is Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Michigan. Her interdisciplinary research examines the cultural aspects of international media with a special focus on media events, rituals, performances, and icons. She is interested in the re-enchantment of society, in the magical moments, the qualities, technologies, and artifacts of contemporary social life worldwide. Not a small project. Her recent book, Stories Without Borders, The Making of a Global Iconic Event, from Oxford University Press just this last year, explores practices of transnational storytelling in the making of global iconic events. She is co-editor of Education and Social Media. She is author and co-author of articles published in journals including Journalism Studies, Columbia Journalism Review, and others. And she was a Lady Davis Fellow at the Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace in Israel in 2014, and a fellow at the Contemporary Center for the Center for Contemporary History in Germany in 2015. Geert Jacobs is a professor of linguistics at the University of Ghent in Belgium. His research focuses on the study of professional institutional discourses in a pragmatic perspective. That's the sort of linguistic discipline of pragmatics, not American pragmatics or other meanings of the term there. I know because partly that's how we know each other. And he has a special interest in news production processes. He actually did wonderful work in terms of thinking about intertextuality, studying press releases, and then looking at news stories and understanding how much of what we see as news is actually generated through press releases by the parties who might be interested in that news coverage. He has published widely articles in journals including Pragmatics, the Journal of Pragmatics, Text and Talk, Public Relations Review, Document Design in the Journal of Sociolinguistics, and he has co-edited volumes including Pragmatics of Crisis, Language Communication, the Economy, Discourse in Organizations, and Discourse of News Management, finally, Discourse, Linguistic Ethnography in Institutions. So very pleased to have them. They've decided to go right exactly in the order in which they were listed here in the program, and so I'm very much looking forward to hearing them present their papers.
I have no slides, but I'm going to stand anyway. I want to thank Charles and Dan very much for this opportunity to speak to, I rarely speak to such an interdisciplinary group. It's a pleasure that I've enjoyed the discussion to this point. And let's see. I'm a little sorry it's so sunny today because I left San Diego 10 years ago, and this makes me wonder why. This is kind of nice. there's a foot of snow in New York at the moment. And an apology, if we run a little over, I'm going to disappear a few minutes after 1 to take a phone call, but maybe we'll actually come in on time. Making health public. It stimulated me to think about how much studies of journalism have missed by understanding news or the news story or journalism as undifferentiated categories. I mean, scholars know perfectly well that the New York Times is not the New York Post, is not CNN, is not Bloomberg News. We know that there's that sort of differentiation. We know also that although editorial writers and op-ed columnists and sports reporters and White House correspondents all call themselves and are called journalists, they do different things. Their products may all appear on the same website or in the same print edition or on the same 30-minute evening newscast. Nonetheless, they operate by different rules. But the studies of news undertaken by political scientists, sociologists, media scholars invariably leave that out and focus in particular on local, national, and international political news stories. There are thousands of articles and hundreds of books on political news as such. There is, so far as I know, one notable book on the human interest story in news. It was published in 1940 by Helen McGill Hughes. There are some others too since then, but it's like it's a category that is not the stereotyped or reified news as social scientists think about it. Even for political news, it's not one thing over time. It has changed quite dramatically. And in the period, say, the 1950s to the 2000s, the most striking change has been that news had been, in the 50s, deferential, sometimes just stunningly deferential, to elected and appointed public officials, to today, and beginning really from the late 1960s on, to news marked by skepticism of what these officials say and a critical edge, a kind of undercutting analytical tone in covering public officials. Studies of news in Sweden, the Netherlands, the UK, the US, and elsewhere have all found the same results. The trend from deferential to more skeptical news coverage has been large and reasonably unbroken for 50 years. Skepticism, or a kind of quasi-independent analytical framework, not just a transcription of official commentary, is one rule. A reporter, another one is a kind of neutrality, a kind of nonpartisanship. A reporter may have political views that lean left or right, but the reader or viewer should not be able to detect them, even between the lines in the mainstream media. What those leanings are should not be evident, except an inclination toward, indeed, a passion for getting the facts right and getting at the truth as best as they can. This rule supposedly applies to all journalists who are not editorial writers or opinion columnists, but there are other exceptions too. Sports reporters, unless they work for a national publication and have no specific local place, like the sports page of the USA Today, are supposed to cover the local sports team, and they are expected to write as explicit partisans. They may be critical of the performance of their team or decisions made by its management, its coaches, or its players, but they are expected to report as if they write always with the winning prospects of the home team in view. A San Francisco sports writer will invariably write from the angle of a San Francisco team. You may have seen the widely circulated photos of the sign held by a boy at the San Francisco Women's March, January 21st. It said, "What do we want? Evidence-based science. When do we want it? After peer review." It catapulted across the internet. Google traces it back at least to 2010 at a pro-science rally in the UK. And I didn't think other countries needed pro-science rallies, but apparently we're not alone in that. And variations of it have turned up repeatedly in protest over the past half dozen years. It's a good symbol, I think, condensing the popular flow we expect in biomedicalization. Wow, I said that whole word. A one-way flow from science and medicine to the public in its standard form. Briggs and Hallen are interested in this, but they're even more interested in the interpenetration of different realms in constituting biomedical knowledge. They see not only biomedicalization, but mediatization at work in medical knowledge itself as it comes to the public, arriving thoroughly mediated by doctors who work in and for media organizations, by public relations specialists working for universities and hospitals and research labs, by PR efforts of pharmaceutical companies, government agencies regulating pharmaceutical companies, and so forth. And that's all a part even of the construction of science and medicine themselves. A little nugget stuck in me from a moment in graduate school. There are quite a number of anthropologists in the room. You'll be pleased to know I didn't go into anthropology, but I started there. I was working on a master's in anthropology, and I took a course called Primate Social Behavior, taught by leaders in that field, Irvin DeVore, most famous in the course for being able to imitate, we presume quite accurately, baboon mating calls. But also, we were all assigned a book called The Emergence of Man by a popular writer and journalist whose name was, I had to look this up, that part I didn't remember, but Robert Pfeiffer. And he told a story, that is, DeVore did, about meeting with Pfeiffer every few months at the time Pfeiffer was writing his books. And Pfeiffer was talking to primate specialists around the world. Now, this was like late 1960s when this book was being written. We weren't on the internet. We didn't send emails. And so when Pfeiffer came through town in Boston and sat down with DeVore, Pfeiffer had more recent information about what the primatologists in Japan were doing and thinking than did DeVore. Now, these were the people he really needed to know about because the Japanese primatologists were, top of the field. And DeVore needed to know. Pfeiffer communicated it to him. Pfeiffer, he was a journalist, basically, but he knew a lot about primatology. That's what he was writing about, the evolution of human beings. And DeVore couldn't wait for each visit. It would keep him up to date with his own field. It helped him be a scholar. That stuck with me. I didn't know what to do with it, but I think it's part of what the Briggs and Hallen book is about. The various components of producing science or expertise that we don't ordinarily think about. If you go back far enough, say into the 19th century, in a lot of the domains of concern to us, concern to me, there was not an interpenetration of domains because separate domains had not yet been separated. In particular, there was no real divide between politics and journalism. 19th century Washington reporters, for example, earned money serving as clerks for congressional committees and sometimes individual congressmen. They were on the payroll of the government at the same time that they were covering the government for one or more news organizations. Journalism differentiated itself from politics beginning really in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, and came to take pride in independence from party and from state. But government came increasingly after World War II to employ journalists full-time in press relations or public relations. A journalist named Richard Conlin was working for a partisan caucus, the Democratic Study Group, in the late 1960s in the House of Representatives. Conlin was executive director of this voluntary caucus that had arisen, and he conceived a strategy for passing important sunshine legislation, 1969, 1970. He conceived this strategy while talking to his old friends in the news media. At first, efforts on this legislation made no headway whatsoever because the Democratic Study Group and other supporters of it could not get the press to be the slightest bit interested. The Democratic Study Group sponsored reforms looked toward reporters, and the reporters said, this is inside Washington stuff. None of us are interested. But one wire service reporter friend of Conlin's grew exasperated with Conlin's exasperation with the press. And he finally blurted out, Dick, why don't you just call your reforms anti-secrecy reforms? That will make reporters drool with pleasure. And the rest is history. The law passed. And secret voting procedures in the House were made public. Cameras came into the House chambers, and so forth. And yes, Conlin's friend was right. Scores and scores of editorials appeared across the country writing in support of the law. That is again, another part of the complication of where our knowledge comes from that enters into the media. In this case, it came in part from a reporter who is no longer a reporter, but who maintained a concern with what the press will accept as legitimate and interesting news. Of all the things that in making health public that appealed to me, I want to speak most about frames, voices, and the journalistic mediation of health and medicine, which they discuss as the subject of Chapter 3. For me, a really striking and illuminating chapter. There they examine a sample of newspapers and network television coverage of health and analyze each story as falling into one or more of three categories. In their study of network television, they ask, is the dominant frame in the story biomedical, where the reporter transmits the view of the medical and scientific community with all of its complications? Or is it lifestyle, that we might also call the neoliberal frame, emphasizing the responsibility of consumers for their own health and their own lifestyle choices? Or is it social, where the reporter examines the way class and race and government provision or lack of it shape the health opportunities and health constraints people find themselves in through no fault nor virtue of their own? And they find, as they anticipated, that biomedical frames are dominant. In coverage of cancer, for instance, 65% of stories were biomedical frame dominant. But that's only 2/3. And what about the other third? Well, they also find that lifestyle dominated in 6% of the time, and interestingly, the social framework dominated 15% of the time, and frequently these stories had more than one important frame included. So a fifth of all stories had some reference to lifestyle as a framing device, and a third of all stories, to my surprise, had some elements of the social frame, more of the social political economy frame. The existing literature assumes there's more domination of the biomedical frame than Dan and Charles found. They are impressed in the end that, quote, the reality is much more complex than the literature would have led them to believe. In their interviews, journalists indicated that they took public policy angles as key criteria of newsworthiness, and so story selection skewed towards stories that can be related to public policy options. They are, in fact, implicitly partisans, that is, the reporters are implicitly partisans of government policy interventions, I think it would be fair to say. Again, quoting Making Health Public, reporters tend to be uncomfortable with broad structural understandings of health issues, often raising them briefly only to shift back toward more familiar solutions at either the individual level or the level of specific policy intervention. That would place reporters as a group well to the left of George Will's "you are responsible for your own health" view of things. If Will defines neoliberal, the news is not neoliberal. Dip back into history briefly one more time. David Reif has observed in a study of 19th century American election coverage that 19th century newspapers were not dominated by reporters. It was a miscellany of voices. Many reprinted stories from other newspapers. There were firsthand accounts of whatever provided by local readers. There was fiction, there was poetry, there were hoaxes, there were government documents printed without any commentary whatsoever. Only in the first decade or two of the 20th century was it common to find front page stories all written by reporters, this new creature. But there is more than one reportorial voice. That's the lesson I draw from Briggs and Hallen. Foreign correspondents, even today, have more leeway to write interpretively and even to write in the first person, as was routine for their 19th century forebears, but has more generally disappeared. The distinctive deference toward the medical community in health news is interesting in that it continues some 2 generations after political reporting grew less deferential toward elected and appointed political leaders. I think that one lesson I would take for media studies at large from this book is that the book reminds us that among the key institutions of journalism, one is what we could simply call genre. There are genres of news writing, multiple ones. There's a study of environmental news on Swedish television that makes the case that we should think of genres as institutions. In the early 60s, Swedish television gave rare but occasional mention of the environment as a topic. By 1970, environmental reporting had changed from portraying environmental problems as isolated problem islands that could be solved by technical and administrative means to a full domain of interconnected issues that called for urgent action. Initially, the environmental reporting genre combined the new critical scrutiny that was new for Swedish public television with what the analysts here call a social pathos orientation or character. The first environmental reporter on Swedish television, Bo Eriksson, was hired in 1970. He left in 1971 because, he said, he was tired of the negativity of environmental reporting. It was the social pathos that got to him. He said, quote, "There were always these environmental alarms. It was always gloom and doom to the extreme. When I think about it, that's the reason I quit. I got dead tired of all the damn alarms." You get a sense of this also in the memoir of a U.S. environmental reporter from that same era who did not quit, Philip Shabakoff, at the New York Times. Shabakoff recalls, though, his editor's prevailing response to his reporting in the early 70s was something like this. What? Another story about the end of the world, Shabakov? We carried a story about the end of the world a month ago. The takeaway for me is that a genre is an institution. Within health community, within health communication, I suspect there are more than one genre, multiple genres. I think also multiple practices and routines. So the viral outbreak story, I think, though there are people who know more about this than I do in the room, that it operates by a different set of rules than your normal, here's a new development in cancer research story. And it has this added feature that there are worries about panic, there are worries about miscommunication that are much more intense than with here's a new scientific development in medicine. And there are reasons for the journalist and for the medical community to be more in touch with the government of all places. Now, I think about this in part because of another genre, a very small but very important genre in news, in which, as I think of it, the reporter or editor acts as Assistant Secretary of Defense. And that's the case, usually the Washington Post or the New York Times, occasionally the Associated Press, occasionally other news organizations, has a story that they're working on that they think bears on national security. Under those circumstances, they notify the White House or the Defense Department or the National Security Agency and say, we got this story, tell us a good reason not to run it. And we have, this is not necessarily, some of it I'm sure is behind the scenes, but some of it has been written about by Bob Woodward and others. It's quite public. And they hold this story while they negotiate with the government. Ultimately, the decision is the news organizations. They don't have military credentials. They're not privy to a lot of the information that the NSA has, and yet they make decisions that they've been told by the government bear directly on national security. What they add to their normal set of rules and regulations about how to write a story is a sense of responsibility to the public. And the gall, you might say, or the courage, you might say, to make those decisions ultimately on their own, advised by the government, but they may break with the government, and they often have broken with the government and said, you made your case to us, we don't believe it, or we don't believe it enough, we're modifying our story here and there, but we're publishing, and they do. So we have all these genres. Even health reporting is not only one genre, it's at least these two. It's the health story and it's the public safety story. They overlap, but they're not the same. And different rules abide for the different kinds of news reporting. That I don't think media studies has attended to sufficiently. I think the detailed and really valuable attention in this book toward understanding the specifics of health reporting suggests to me that we should be writing the same sort of book about every one of these genres. I hope we can keep them down to a reasonable number, but you could have started a series.
Coming up. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank our audience for surviving 30-minute talks. That's not a small feat of concentration. And I would like to give a special thanks to Dan and Charles for the invitation. I'm really enjoying this conference. I'm learning a lot. So I would like to start with an anecdote. Last year, I accepted 2 PhD students at the University of Michigan as advisor. And on the left, you see Yuval Katz, who is working in the area of peace, how peace is conceptualized in digital spheres. And on the right, you see Young-Rim Kim from South Korea, whose topic is the media representations of infectious disease. Oops, something. Speaking of technology. Okay, so when they first came to my office, one by one, I had an easy time with Yuval. I thought I was, relatively competent in giving advice on what to read and how to start up his studies as a PhD student. And then came Haley, it's her American name, and we started to think about how to study her topic. And I accepted her into the program because I thought it would be a challenging topic, but I didn't know how much it would be in terms of selecting courses for her. Do I send her to the public health department at the University of Michigan? Certainly we don't have any offerings in communication studies or anything in connection with health news. So we were very interested in finding the relevant literature, but also the relevant departments for her to study at. And then your book came, I gave the book to her, she read it, and was incredibly happy, contacting me immediately that finally I feel like I have a home in the discipline. So I wanted to share this only to say that, I'm sure this book will be successful in many ways, but it is already successful in making one PhD student very happy. And I think that's no small thing to achieve. Okay. So I took the question seriously, how can health journalism inform media studies? That's the central question today. And for me, the key message of your book was the increasing prevalence and power of the linear transmission model in communication studies. So this is a model we often think in communication studies not so strong anymore, not so present. It's not what guides our thinking. But what your book made me realize that it's not only very strong in this particular subfield of health news, but it might be the dominant paradigm through which we discuss the role of media generally in public debates. So for those of you who are not in communication studies, just a little very quick overview of what do I mean by transmission view and what do they mean by that. One of the key distinctions here comes from James W. Carey. He's a thinker that everybody knows in communication studies and practically nobody knows outside of communication studies. And so there is a whole study of disciplinary boundaries in that sense. But his key claim from 1989 is a key distinction between transmission view and ritual view of communication. Ritual view is described as uses not information but drama, news portrays an arena of dramatic forces and action. So the key metaphor here is in some ways theater. You have a performative action in connection with mediated communication. You have an audience and you have a media performing messages, but not simply or merely communicating information. In contrast to that, the transmission view, as you can see, is defined by terms such as imparting, sending, transmitting, or giving information to others. So there is a clear linear transmission idea that you send a message, somebody receives it, and there is in between a channel. It's unbelievably kind of simplistic in some ways, but it is a powerful metaphor of communication. And so he concludes that the ritual view of communication is directed not toward the extension of messages in space, but toward the maintenance of society in time. Now, this is a very weird sentence altogether, because I would say, you maintain societies in time through the extension of messages in space. So, it's clearly not a best structured differentiation, and it's very easy to deconstruct this distinction of Carey between transmission view and ritual view. But my point is here that it's a powerful toolkit to think with, and what your book showed to me that the transmission view is still incredibly powerful in public debates. I also learned very much through your book how much the debates of health news are really still confined to health communication. And that reminds me really on the story of Haley, how hard it was to find the literature for her, because almost everything was in a subfield of health communication and in public health research in general. At the same time, to me, the most interesting aspects of your book were the cases when certain professions, for instance, journalists, pushed back and drew boundaries when it comes to this transmission view. My favorite quote was the New York Times health reporter, "I'm not an educator, I'm an entertainer." It sounds flippant, maybe, but if people can't read past the first paragraph or two, then I haven't done my job. I want people to start a story and finish it. That's my job. So think about it. What is interesting here, really, that in contrast to what Dan mentioned in his introduction, that there is this imagination of the media as being way too sensationalist, as being only storytellers. Here we have a journalist who actually claims, I am an entertainer, I'm not an educator, that's not what I want to do, and proudly presents this professional ideal in an interview context in which even, it's directly quoted by the authors. Another area where I believe currently the transmission view is very much present is the debate of fake news. That's why I think that the transmission view, what you have showed within the area of health news, is really not confined to that subfield, but is the dominant views through which we still discuss media in public debates. What do I mean by that? So if you think about the fake news debate that is going on at the moment very strongly in the United States, what is the premise of that debate? It is that you have to give facts to people, and if they get the facts, all of them, and in the right format, they will vote in the right way. You couldn't imagine, a stronger embodiment of the transmission view than this one. You provide the facts, and they will vote according to. It's really the question is, are the facts there for them? I mean, what this debate, I believe, misses in a fundamental way is really the question of mythologies and how do we understand the role of the media. It's a famous remark by President Trump at the CIA headquarters. I almost said ICA. That's, for communication studies scholars, internal joke. Anyway, as you know, I have a running war with the media. They are among the most dishonest human beings on earth. So think about the language here. Dishonest. So the key problem for him is a lack of honesty. So a lack of sharing of actual, detailed, accurate facts. So how media here is described as a transmitter of facts and information. And in this particular case, President Trump thinks that the media didn't serve that role well. What I believe that the debate fundamentally really misses is the question of mythologies. That there is another way to describe the election and the result, and that's a clash between powerful myths, powerful imaginaries, powerful imaginations of social life. And on the left side, you see Make America Great Again. And there I think the most powerful book probably published is The Politics of Resentment by Catherine Kramer. So this imagination of an America that in some ways has never existed, that is white, that is non-diverse, that is non-global, that is rich, where factories remain there, where you keep your jobs, and so on. And on the right side, you see a different America that is diverse, that is global, where things are complicated, and where things will remain complicated. And all you can say is that we are stronger in it together. But you are not claiming that it will be easier, that it will be less complicated in any ways. Or you are saying that we are in it together and we will somehow manage it. I mean, these are two mythologies clashing in an event called the American elections. And to me, it's striking that the complexity of this election and its outcome was reduced to this very simple understanding of fake news. Now you have a complex social phenomenon, traditions coming into it, deep-rooted beliefs in the United States, and how do we analyze it? We claim, well, if the media had been more accurate, we would have a different result. It is a striking simplification of social life and the understanding of media, at least in my opinion. So I want to say a few words about my work as well and how it relates to yours. Just grab a little water. So this is my new book, Stories Without Borders, the Berlin Wall and the Making of a Global Iconic Event. And in this book, I raised the question how we can tell the story of an event in a way that people would remember it internationally and over time. So in other words, using your vocabulary, the question here is the mediatization of event making. You have confusing, contradictory happenings on the ground, and you want to construct them into powerful events that people would remember internationally and over time. And how do you do that? So the case study that I was looking at is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is an image that most of you probably recall or have seen by the fall of the Berlin Wall, this kind of celebratory moment of freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall, in reality, if we can call it, looked like this. It was an incredibly boring press conference. Yeah. And all of us who have attended very boring meetings throughout life, you know how it feels. So it was a very boring press conference where a new travel regulation was announced. And this new travel regulation, I will be very brief, just I want to show the practices of mediatization at stake here, had two key elements. One, that you needed passports and visas as an East German to cross to the West. And the other was that this new regulation would not go into effect on the day of the press conference, only a day later. Why? Because people would slowly apply for passports and visas, and the Secret Service and the agencies and so on would have enough time to prepare. This all sounds good, but the person, the party official who was asked to announce this new travel regulation did not read the travel law when he went into it. He spent most likely hard to prove the day with his lover from the Central Committee. So he didn't read the regulation. He went into the press conference, and when he got journalistic questions about the new travel regulation, he had a hard time answering them. The key question was, when does the new regulation go into effect? He looked at the document carefully, great confusion, and he picked up two words: immediately, without delay. So instead of the delayed effect, he actually announced accidentally the immediate effect of this new travel law. This is how the fall of the Berlin Wall happened. Okay, so American historian Robert Darnton called it actually a colossal misunderstanding. But that's not how we remember it. And so here comes, practices of mediatization. 5 minutes, and this is not yet the age of social media, 5 minutes after the press conference. Hi, can we help him? Yeah. The Associated Press put out this interpretation. So East Germany opens borders. So instead of saying that it was a confusing, contradictory event, and we have no idea what's happening, and we will get back to you with details later, they announced the opening of the border. And then the media, over 4.5 hours, convinced people to test the borders and make this event happen. So this is a case of mediatization when you have journalists announcing an event before it actually happened. They over and over convinced people to test the borders and made this event actually happen. This is my favorite sentence from the covering of the event. This is the West German Walter Cronkite and the most watched evening news. He announced that the gates of the wall are wide open. He announced this at a moment when all the gates of the wall were closed. Like not one was open. And since it was the most watched evening news, people really listened, went to the border, and made the event happen. He gave an interview before he died, sort of a few weeks before his death, and he got a question about journalistic, professional ideas. What is the most important value for you? He says it's objectivity. And what is the most important sentence in your life? He said the gates of the wall are wide open. And he didn't see it for 1 second that there could be some level of contradiction between the two. So I found a very different scene while interviewing journalists than you did, in that sense that I found a very strong belief in objectivity, in covering the exact facts, and very rarely this kind of storyteller role that you were able to receive from journalists, acknowledging that they construct a mythology, that they are telling a story to people, and it's not always the educator role, but also the entertainer role. So I built up this concept of global iconic events, which is really a concept of mediatization, where I believe that the storytelling of events first builds on foundations, so you know something about the event in advance. So if it's the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know about the story of the Berlin Wall. Mythologization is a construction of a mythical message in connection with an event. In this particular case, it's end of division and freedom. Events also get condensed into a simple phrase, short narrative, and recognizable visual scene. In the case of the fall of the Berlin Wall, within 3 days, it was called the fall of the Berlin Wall. We see this incredible speed of naming in connection with contemporary events as well. And then we have contrasting narratives and the powerful spread of the events in the form of remediation. So this was one story about mediatization, but I also want to say a few words about my next book, which is also inspired by these questions of transmission and ritual you also raise throughout your book. My next book is on charm. It's a very different topic. So we all know charming people who don't necessarily follow prescribed rules. They don't score that well on standardized tests, but they still win somehow through life. So I became really interested in how charm is constructed, especially on screens, because very often the forms of charms that we see are actually, charming people in mediatized settings on various forms of media settings. So the case that we are looking at the moment with research assistants is the Iranian nuclear negotiations from 2015. So I wanted to choose a very rational setting. You could not imagine probably a more rational setting than a nuclear negotiation setting, So it's really about technical details, incredible complexity, and so on. But what I have found that one of the key figures there was Mohammad Zarif, the foreign minister from Iran, who is an incredibly charming person, presented as such in both the American and the Israeli media that we have analyzed. This is the typical image of Zarif in American media. Smiling, happy, interacting. He embodies a different image of Iran immediately and deconstructs some of the fears that some people have about Iran and its past, and projects a new hope, a new message about his country. So what we have found that Zarif throughout is presented as either smiling, happy, sharing jokes and so on, or in deep conversation with the American side. So here you have mediatized charm and mediatized sympathy in the form of meaningful interaction. So that's the New York Times. Another example, sitting at a table, in good mood, discussing complicated issues of international security. And this is the Wall Street Journal, which was generally more critical about the nuclear deal, but certainly not different in its representation of Mohammad Zarif. Very similarly presented as the chief negotiator, somebody who is a meaningful partner, somebody we can relate to. Now, in contrast to that, both in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times that we have looked at in detail so far, while we have different mindsets about the nuclear deal, we have a very different representation of the key actors. So here we have Netanyahu, who almost on all of the images is either completely alone or with himself. Here you have Netanyahu surrounded by himself, but not in interaction with anybody else. So that's one typical way, and you can't blame it on the Wall Street Journal of being very negative towards Netanyahu. So it's not negative bias in a direct narrative sense, but in imagery certainly there. And this is New York Times. So when Netanyahu is not with himself, then he's completely alone. Certainly not displaying qualities, easy to relate, personal elements that we could easily sympathize with. Another example, one of the most powerful images of the nuclear deal negotiations and Netanyahu's visit to the United States. So note that they look in different directions, barely an interaction. Obviously, the color coding of the ties was no accident, that he practically looks a Republican just by the tie itself, but also the lack of meaningful interaction. And I would like to emphasize that these are not, cherry-picked, selected images. This is a tendency we have seen throughout. So in this case, what I'm interested in is the mediatization of enchantment. What does it mean to have this powerful personal quality presented on screens? But I'm also interested in how we encounter charm and magical qualities in everyday life as well. And the claim that I'm trying to debunk in my work, and I found your book really useful, is this claim by Max Weber that the fate of our time is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all by the disenchantment of the world. I would believe that there are quite a lot of acts of enchantment in the contemporary world, and many of them are mediatized, and your book made me think deeper about practices of mediatization in this context as well. Thank you.
Right. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to say thank you to Charles and Dan for setting up 2 fabulous, inspiring days. Just like Julia, I'll start with an anecdote about how your book actually started to serve as a beacon for one of my PhD students. A couple of days ago, one of my PhD students, who is working on multimodality in business and academic presentations, reported to me on a brief encounter that she had during the coffee break of a conference in Europe with one of the big names in multimodal discourse studies. Now, the PhD student had told him that she was combining, the typical fine-grained, software-based analysis of multimodality, including analysis of pitch and tone and volume, with some linguistic ethnography, including interviews with the presenters in her corpus. And apparently the big name's reply to her was, don't bother, that's so 19th century. We have other far more advanced tools to deal with that. Now, she was shocked, and so was I. And I must say I'm happy to find myself in the company of a lot of people I know, do feel differently about this kind of approach. And so I was able to reassure my PhD student by showing her one of my favorite quotes from Charles and Dan's book. So let me share with you what they write very early in the book, after having spelled out their ambition in studying the interplay between media and medicine. It was clear that we would never be able to answer our questions by just reading, watching, and listening to stories. We had to be there when they were being made, and we had to listen to all of the parties talking about their roles. As you can see, we're still in the Roman number pages. I got further on in the book. And a couple of lines below that, Charles and Dan go on to argue that if you don't do this, if you don't go out and talk to people, then you're bound to fail to capture features, sites, and actors who seldom, if ever, make it into the content of these stories. Now, in line with Didier Fassin's claim, and Rosemary actually referred to him earlier today, his claim that ethnography is all about revealing the unknown, uncovering hidden practices. It's exactly because of this ambition to capture features, sites, and actors who never make it onto the front stage that within my Ghent-based news, talk, and text linguistic research network, we've been going into newsrooms, right, of all sorts, trying to document meticulously how journalists are going about their daily business of making the news. Now, no doubt, our and many other scholars' efforts to investigate how the news is produced may initially have led to what Karen Weil-Jorgensen has called a journalist-centeredness, all right? Foregrounding the role of this one highly visible professional at the expense of those of other, many other professionals out there in the newsroom. However, there is now interesting new work redirecting our attention to those other professionals who are active in the newsroom. And one example I mentioned here on the slide is a study by Astrid van den Dalen, who turns to the so-called copy editors for newspapers as what she calls the forgotten stepchildren of the newsrooms. Right? There's a long tradition in media discourse studies looking at the syntax of headlines, right? Newspaper headlines. And a lot of the people doing that kind of research never bothered to talk to the journalists let alone to talk to the copy editors who made, the last-minute amendments to newspaper copy, including writing up the headlines. Now, some of this work has inevitably focused on the impact of technology-driven routines and other pretty mundane logistics at the heart of the news production process, leading David Domingo in a recent article in Journalism to conclude that this new wave of news production research has somewhat served to downplay the agency of the news professionals. And so Domingo argues that we have to think about the normative role that we take on as researchers in society. Just like ethnographers typically are highly reflective about the impact of their presence on the field they are investigating, Domingo says that we need to be aware of the way we disseminate our research and how this may well change people's perceptions of our informants, of the journalists, of the copy editors, and of what they are doing in the newsroom. In a recent edited volume for Palgrave, together with Glenn Alessi, I call these two considerations the ins and the outs of researching professional discourse. And Astrid van den Dalen, who I just talked about, is a fine case in point, as she takes on what I would call almost an activist approach in drawing attention to the key role played by these forgotten stepchildren, right? These copy editors, and the impact they have on the newspapers that we get to read on a daily basis. Now, talking about failing to capture certain sites, there's not just journalist-centeredness, there's also some newsroom-centeredness, which has led us to ignore other, perhaps more hidden, but equally crucial professional arenas that impact on what ends up in the papers, on TV, on the radio, etc. This reminds me of Charles and Dan's reference to Bruno Latour's averted gaze, with Latour and his collaborators turning away in his classic science and technology study from how PR and media professionals work alongside scientists in the production of scientific knowledge. The impact of PR, in particular, was ignored for decades in media discourse studies from a linguistic point of view. In fact, I remember my early linguistic work on the genre of press releases back in the mid-90s wasn't exactly perceived as pioneering by my fellow linguists. People in the wider field of social linguistics thought it was marginal and outlandish, perhaps exotic at best, which was in sharp contrast with communication science, which had had a long-standing interest in so-called information subsidies. Charles and Dan refer to Jesper Strombach's 4 phases of mediatization in this context, with a final phase, that of PreImmediateization, covering how media logics are incorporated into the culture and the practices of those who have an interest in what I would call managing the news, right, as different from making the news. And in Strombach's case, it's about the media colonizing politics. Now, returning to this original claim that you have to be there, when the stories are being made, and that you have to listen to all of the parties talking about their roles, there's an interesting 2007 article by, and it's not quoted very often, so I'd be surprised if some of you know it. It's an article by a Danish scholar, Kim Christian Schroeder, who looks at Norman Fairclough's classic analysis of the British TV programme Crime Watch UK, and who argues that this dimension of going inside, the newsroom, going backstage, this dimension of what he calls discourse practice, has been massively neglected in critical discourse analysis. And Schroeder says, well, why did Fairclough not talk to some of the people on the production team? And I quote, "It would not have taken an inordinate amount of time." And at the other end of the spectrum, right, as far as the uptake or the reception of the program is concerned, Schroeder is not very happy with Fairclough trying to second guess the program experience of the audience. He was just trying to speculate. People will probably think this or that. And Schroeder says, well, a simple focus group session with a handful of viewers would have done the job. So discourse ethnography is the label that Schroeder proposes for an approach that takes these discourse practices more seriously than CDA has ever done, and that combines careful attention to textual detail with more systematic fieldwork that explores the worlds of both the text producers and the text receivers, if you can put it that way. Now, all of this is the background against which 2.5 years ago I teamed up with colleagues from sociology and communication science, as well as from the medical faculty at Ghent University, to set up our health, media and society project. This is kind of an empty slide, but I want to draw your attention to our nice little logo there. Without really knowing it at that time, we sort of started out from the very notion that is at the heart of Charles and Dan's book, namely that medicine and public health are inseparable from communication and media. From day one, when we started this project, ours was what we then called a holistic start-to-end perspective. Although, you know, start-to-end sounds pretty linear, but that's not what we meant at all. We were trying to find out how elderly-related health news travels from the press offices of pharmaceutical companies announcing new drugs, through a wide range of different media, all the way down to the public and the patients. But in taking this perspective, as I said, we didn't think of a linear perspective. We thought it was very much, you know, recursive and highly complex. We anticipated, basically very much like Charles and Dan do in their book, that the media take up residence in the clinics and in the headquarters of Big Pharma, and that at the same time, health professionals are deeply embedded in media spheres. We never assumed a linear translation process. Instead, we expected the intense co-production and the kind of complex entanglement that making health public is all about. Now, what I'll do in the next 10, 15 minutes or so is zoom in on 2 cases from this project that illustrate this interpenetration between the worlds of medicine and media, and I'll try to demonstrate the added value of a linguistic ethnographic perspective, even if we don't have the time to go into the nitty-gritty of some of the data here. Now, the first case is taken from fieldwork that we conducted at the press office of a pharmaceutical company in Belgium. I'm drawing here on an analysis by one of my collaborators, Jana de Klerk, who, starting out from the notion of corporate identity as multi-layered and dynamic, as a discursive construction basically, demonstrated how the various stakeholders in this pharmaceutical company, in particular the many staff that she interviewed, how they echo the corporate identity, or plural, identities, as officially envisioned by the management and represented in all the corporate documentation, while at the same time struggling to align that official identity with other, sometimes highly conflicting narratives as they are told elsewhere by others, in the media in particular. Now let me make that more specific. Jana's data show that a lot of what is said and done in the company is heavily dominated by this figure, right? It's the founder of the company. And his story dominates the official corporate identity of the organization. His pictures, his quote, his biography were everywhere in the company, on the website, in the buildings, right? This man passed away a couple of years ago, but some of the older employees worked together with him, and so they have memories to share of somebody who was generally considered to be these 3 things. I hope you can read this at the bottom of the slide. He was seen as a very inspiring human being who always put the other, that is, the patient, first. He was also seen as an exceptional scientist, as a researcher of world quality, and he was seen as a strong leader. And this was a consistent message that was conveyed to us across a number of interviews with stakeholders, the staff in particular. Now, all of this makes, if not for a coherent, at least for an omnipresent story that was co-constructed, right? It was top-down It was taken down, top down through the official communication because, his story was in the official brochures on the website, but it was also constructed bottom up in a lot of informal employee narratives. Now that's one story. On the other hand, based on fine-grained analysis of the interactional dynamics of a number of backstage meetings as well as interviews that we were able to conduct, we discovered that there's also a counter-narrative at work, one that is definitely driven by media reports on a so-called bad pharma industry. An industry whose identity is determined by excessive profit, by market-driven research, by lack of transparency, and of course by medicalization, biomedicalization, right? With basically conditions being invented and normal social or physical processes being discursively transformed into problems, all of which is, of course, meant to sell more medication. Now, it's crucially that the struggle between these two narratives, right, that the founder on the one hand versus the bad pharma story, wasn't just internalized by the members of staff in far away, backstage meeting rooms. It was also there in the company's official corporate communication. And I remember our first day, when we went into the lobby of the main building of the pharmaceutical company's headquarters. There was a larger-than-life picture of the founder, and sitting next to it was, a set of marketing posters, one of which read, "What if we would improve our patients' safety by reporting all adverse effects?" Which, of course, refers to the industry, long history of underreporting the negative effects of experimental treatments in clinical trials. So here it was, the founder sitting next to a poster that was actually very explicitly referring to the bad pharma narrative. Now, what these and other data drawn from our fieldwork demonstrate, in our view, is that, in Johannes Angermüller's words, we cannot talk or write without mobilizing a multitude of voices, some of which are marked as close to us, others as more far away. However fixed, hegemonic, pure a discourse may appear at first sight, there is no meaning without gaps and fissures, no text which doesn't contain the traces of other voices, no discourse which stages power, right, the founder, without its critique, the bad pharma narrative. And note that this is where I got the title from for this paper today, with the linguistic ethnographer's mission all about unfixing meaning that seems to be pretty fixed at first sight along the lines that Angermüller suggests. That the media is taking up residence in the headquarters of Big Pharma also comes out very strongly in Jana's data when she documents how intensively the head of PR, who was a main informant, and he was, high up in the company's hierarchy, how intensively he wanted to be heard by her as a researcher. How eager he was not just to talk about the founder, but also to open up about the bad pharma narrative. It was a shock for both Jana and myself to realize that by lending him, the microphone for an ethnographic interview, we were actually giving him a voice. The junior researcher, Jana, she was empowering the top executive, right? And I would say that in line with what Catherine Smith has argued, the authority that the head of PR exercises in his professional position clearly is only partially transferred to the interview space. And I would suggest one explanation for this lies in what Charles and Dan call PreImmediateization. Just like the company's corporate identity is many-layered and dynamic and complex, the head of PR may well be multiply positioned. On the one hand, carrying a lot of power and expertise from the medical field, but at the same time, he was highly vulnerable in the way he's had to incorporate all the negative bad pharma news exposure. And we can talk about that later during the Q&A. I'm not sure how I'm doing for timing. I need 5 more minutes or so. Would that be okay? Yeah. I'll just briefly hint at a second way in which the two worlds of medicine and media get enmeshed in our data. And this second way has to do with the concept of healthism. All right? Healthism refers to the increasing social attention to healthy lifestyles. The term was coined by Robert Crawford back in the 1980s to refer to the dissemination of the medical ideology among non-experts, resulting in expert patients. Quite close, I guess, to the neoliberal lifestyle frame that was referred to earlier today. Expert patients who no longer see their doctor as the sole and monolithic source of medical expertise, who claim a more active role in the healthcare process. Now, one highly tangible result is the rising interest in matters related to, diet and nutrition and healthy food, with, at the media end of the spectrum, the emergence of a range of new so-called soft news genres, including the kind of televised infotainment show that Jana and I were able to study closely in our Health, Media and Society project, and that I will just briefly talk about in the final part of this paper. Now, in terms of soft news, Carsten Reinemann and his colleagues define soft news on the basis of 3 dimensions: topic, focus, and style. Soft news is low in political relevance. It zooms in on the individual, the private, rather than the social and the collective or the public. And the tone, obviously, is more personal, more emotional. In the past, there's been a consistent bias in media discourse studies towards hard news genres. And I guess this ties in with what Michael was saying about news as an undifferentiated category. There was a bias, and there still is a strong bias towards newspapers, towards daily news broadcasts on the radio, on TV. But drawing on the data that we collected here, I'd like to argue that the rise of healthism makes it impossible to ignore soft news for those who are interested in the interface between health and media. Now, for the project, we were able to negotiate, as I said, access to the editorial board of an infotainment show, right? This doesn't look like your regular news broadcast. This looks like infotainment, right? And the show was focused on nutrition. You can see the name of the show there. It's in Dutch. It means about eating or about food. And these were the 2 main presenters. And they're somewhat on the borderline between journalists and entertainers, although the guy on the right, at some point in his career was a full-fledged political journalist. The program is produced by the Current Affairs Department of Belgium's Dutch language public broadcaster. Its underlying ambition was to focus on fact-checking and revealing potentially controversial issues related to food and health. In doing so, they were trying to reach out to a broad audience in an entertaining way, and I'm using their words, right? I guess they were pretty successful in doing so, as they reached an average market share of 37.9%. In a Belgian context, that's really good. It's a 45-minute program, and typically it included 5 features: a health story focusing on the nutritional aspects of a certain type of food. I remember, an item on smoothies. Second, a day in the life of a celebrity, telling us about their food choices. 3, an item about the production process of certain foods, and they played it backwards. I remember the story of how kebab is made, and if you look at this backwards, it's kind of an intimidating experience. There was an item on the marketing of food, for instance, children's marketing and its impact on kids' health. And finally, there was a quiz. So I think this ties in very much with Julia's view on the ritual perspective on news, I guess. Now, the item that I'll talk about very, very briefly now was on the health risk of eating, charred or burnt meat, you know, the blackened sausages on your barbecue, which can be assessed by measuring the amount of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And, you know, this is associated with a cancer risk, and in Europe this is regulated by the European Union. Now, I'll have to cut a long story short here, but based on our analysis of the audio recordings of many heated discussions at the heart of the editorial team, we were able to, you know, explore how the editors of this program, on the one hand, they were drawing on the traditional, you know, sometimes conflicting, but they were drawing on the journalistic practices and the frames of storytelling, you know, objectivity, newsworthiness, clarity, also some entertainment. That's why I call them conflicting. But also, crucially, they were bringing in complex biomedical concepts. They were talking about risk assessment, about multi-factor analysis. They were talking about all sorts of numbers and population statistics. So as they were setting up, you know, what they did was they set up their own small experiment where they were trying to find out, you know, if you produce your own barbecue, how much of these chemical things end up in them. And the editors, you know, they were explicitly reflecting on issues related to validity and reliability of their own little experiment. And you would not directly associate that with journalists or, you know, people working on an infotainment show. So they were saying, you know, what if the statistics are spectacular? What are we going to say to our audience? What if they are underwhelming? How can we contextualize the numbers? How should we be referring to medical risks? How didactic do we need to be in this kind of program? Now, what I mean is that the editorial team was consistently trying to strike a middle ground between news values and biomedical concerns. And I guess that's what we would call PreImmediateization. I just need 30 more seconds to wrap this up. You know, Fassin, who I referred to very early on, he talks about, you know, disseminating the unknown, revealing the unknown. To him, ethnography is also about interrogating the obvious and questioning the self-evident. And I would say that the two cases I've talked about can be seen in this light too, challenging the consensus ideas about what an infotainment show is and, you know, about corporate identity construction in a pharmaceutical company. The point I've been trying to make is that for both of these activities, the illuminating and the interrogating, PreImmediateization has proved a very interesting concept for us. You know, and together with the context-sensitive analysis of language use proposed by linguistic ethnography, it's been a very powerful eye-opener for that. So thank you to Dan and Charles.
Well, I'm pleased to say that thanks to our three presenters keeping to time, we were right on time and have 30 minutes for them to address your questions and comments.
Thank you. Funny how that just appears. What a wonderful panel. Each panel I think, oh, that was a really good juxtaposition. And then the next one comes and it's like, oh, that's a really good juxtaposition. So I'm interested in, Professor Schudson, your concept of genres. And so this is maybe a question for you, but others as well, and maybe you, Charles. One of the researchers that has really influenced my work has been Shanto Iyengar. And Iyengar wrote a book called Is Anyone Responsible? That examined television and not just how different stories were framed, but also how audiences responded to those frames. And so he could draw conclusions about not just what was there and the logical sort of theoretical conclusion, but how did people actually change their opinions about policy based on what they saw. And it's a very crude brush because he could do experiments that were 15-minute news broadcasts and just change one story and find pretty profound effects. But the way he was talking about frames was a structural frame, not necessarily a genre or a literary frame, the way I would think of how all the linguistic discussion we've been having positions frames as being about medicine or about food or about a topic. Instead, what he did is he talked about episodic and thematic frames. And this is in television. So episodic frames were about events, they were short stories, they were very focused. Thematic frames were, they were about the episodics were about events or people, something that happened. I used to characterize it like Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it was, kind of deal. Thematic frames were, the stories were a little bit longer. They included an event or whatever the news hook was, because they had to get on television for the typical journalistic reason a story gets on television. But they also included something else, a little bit of history, a little bit of context, a little bit of something else. They weren't necessarily longer stories. So we're not talking about, news stories versus dissertations here. They're still news stories. When we're working with folks in community groups, we characterize this research as the difference between a portrait and a landscape. So a thematic story embeds the portrait in the landscape. And the thing that he found that was so profound for our work was that when people saw a thematic story, no matter what the topic was, and then were asked, well, what should we do about this problem? They would answer in ways that included institutions or government as part of the solution. And from a public health perspective, that was very valuable to us because generally speaking, that's where the solutions sat. Whereas an episodic story, when people were asked, what should we do about this issue, whatever it was, then they would answer in ways that put the individual and personal responsibility at the center along the lines of either the healthism or the neoliberal lifestyle story, that kind of thing. And I just wonder what you think about the way stories are structured as opposed to the content, and could bring that into the analysis a little bit.
Thank you. I'm not sure this is an answer, but I'll try. Iyengar's work raises very interesting questions about the effects of news. And I'm just remembering back to his earlier book, because I did not read Is Anyone Responsible? Is that? Right. But I remember having some qualms about the earlier book, News That Matters, on a sort of methodological ground. So he finds surprisingly large consequences if you add one extra story about topic A in a truly fake newscast, then people are more likely to say that topic A is one of the leading problems in the world today. And what makes me wonder about that piece of research is that I don't think any genuine human being other than possibly a pollster believes that anyone that has a view on what is the most important problem in the world today. So I don't. I mean, I think there are lots of important problems in the world today. But if you've just mentioned one, that's more likely to come to mind. If he had asked about something people actually had strong feelings about, my hunch is that no matter what he put on the news, it wouldn't have changed their minds. So I think his research is probably quite misleading about that, about how effective news is. Okay, that's sort of a preface. Does it make a difference whether it's what he calls episodic or what he calls thematic in the way a news story is organized? That I'm more willing to give some credit to, and I do think on that topic there has been a move. I mean, it's part of what I was suggesting about the more analytical, more interpretive style of news in mainstream media, television as well as print. That the straight, here's what happened today, here's what the president said, here's what the Democrat said in response, the end. They're not like, they do some of that still, yes. But the push within journalism is give it some context, provide us some analysis, put it, you know, how's that different from what happened in the last administration? And in fact, I'm not sure about television, but on print, stories are longer. You know, they've consistently grown longer over most of the last century. So does that matter? Well, I don't know in the Iyengar style, you know, does it make someone change their opinion? I think it matters in that it's better journalism, in my view, and in the view of, you know, lots and lots of people who think decontextualized information is not what journalism should be about. And it's probably episodic versus thematic is probably different from what I was trying to get at with genres, but yeah, there are different ways to talk about this.
I have something to add on that. So I think the challenge there is with that type of FX research is, I mean, how long do you have the effect, and also in what context? So, you know, I spend a lot of time at airports, and I always find it striking how much people ignore all the screens that are around. You know, they do everything possible instead of paying attention to all the media content provided. So the question is, of course, you are sitting in a lab and you are, you know, presented with these pieces of news. You are forced to react to it in the FX research context. You may not react to it at all, or forget it, or eat popcorn instead, or, you know, anything in everyday life. And the other is really the lasting effects thing. I mean, obviously, quite a lot of research try to show that there is long-term effect of certain news items, and in some cases with success. But so, for instance, how do we define long-term? Would it be, you know, relevant in 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 month? And does it mean that you have to go back to the researcher answering that question? Are you more likely to say that, yes, I remember and I still hold this view then? You know, so we are running into a lot of troubles as media researchers when we try to use that frame.
Yeah, just very briefly, does it matter how the news is structured? As a linguist, of course, I say yes, absolutely. Let me just briefly refer to a small research project we're engaged in at the moment, where, you know, for this infotainment show that I talked about, we're actually looking at the uptake of the program on Twitter. And, you know, this was a very popular program, so there was, you know, a lot of people watching it, and a lot of people were tweeting live, you know, reacting to what was said on the program. And we can actually track, you know, when the tweets came up and at what point in the show people started reacting. So we're hoping to, you know, get some idea of how the structure of the program is affecting audience uptake in that way.
Well, I might recognize myself and jump in. First of all, a couple of comments. It's really a tragedy that you left anthropology, Michael. But no. Julia, for your book on charm, which sounds wonderful, you've got to do President Chavez, one of the most charming communicators, and really thinking about the success of the Venezuelan Revolution, in some sense as infected with Chavez's charm. I think he'd be very interesting. But I'd like to actually build on something that sort of came up as a polarity with regard to ethnography, and maybe broaden it from Geert's talk, which is, on the one hand, what are we doing? Are we with the sort of one part of Didier Fasson's notion that we're finding things that are hidden that nobody else can see? I mean, in terms of, these are three very scholarly presentations. So what's the scholar doing here? Finding things that are hidden, or with Ralph Ellison, sort of helping us see anew things that are hidden right out in the open? Are we trying to take forms of knowledge production which we're all engaged, and engage in dialogue Or is it more, we're finding things that really actually somehow get missed? What do you think in terms of the work that you've done here?
Well, there's something really ambiguous about the news because, when you, and I'm sure a lot of you have the same experience, when you talk about your research on the news, everyone has their own opinions about it because it's very much out there open. So, in a way, you could say there's hardly anything new to be discovered about the news because, it's out there. So, in a way, the kind of research that we're doing would be about interrogating the obvious, trying to challenge the consensus. But at the same time, once you're inside the newsrooms, you discover that hardly anyone's ever been there apart from the journalists and a couple of trainees. And I briefly referred to this massive tradition of media discourse studies. There's literally hundreds or thousands linguists, applied linguists, sociolinguists that have analyzed the news. Perhaps a handful have actually gone into newsrooms and talked to journalists. So this is where the notion of, revealing the unknown does come in, because all of a sudden when you tell them about the way the news is made, at least for linguists, it's completely new to them. So I guess it's both. It's very much known. At the same time, once you go behind the scenes, you end up with the unknown. Not sure.
If I can add to that, I can't quote this because it's an article I can't quote the author because I don't know who the author is. It's an article I just reviewed for a journal. So I'll say this much about it. It's about a turn in sociology of media toward more of an emphasis on practice as a central concept, and what are the set of practices that guide, direct, and are enacted by reporters in the newsroom, and finds a lot of commonality across big name theorists like Giddens and Latour and Bourdieu, all coming down to say practice is what we have to look at. And then concludes quite interestingly that actually hardly any studies have looked at practice while it's happening. That is, there's a lot of interviews of reporters about what did you do last week or last year or when you wrote this story. But a handful of studies where they were on the scene watching the reporter go through the performance of a practice. So I was struck by that. Maybe we're interrogating the obvious, but we mostly failed to do some kind of obvious things. And it was an obvious thing to look at health news and study it and look at the different forms of it, but I don't think there were various generalizations about that before your book, but you know the area better than I do, but I don't think there were that many studies that actually said, this is a complex body of material, let's see if we can find some concepts that will help us to assess it better. And the objective is getting closer to the data. I think a lot of the things that we think are obvious turn out not to be obvious, and a lot of the things that we think are simple turn out, as you guys found, more complicated than our generalizations have been about that. So that, I think it's just the task of knowing the world better.
Yes. Thank you for the Charles idea. And I would like to urge anybody, if you have further ideas of what I should include in the charm, is more than welcome. One key term that I'm really interested in that project is charm offensive. This is something that is discussed in public debates too, but also in international relations literature. And that's the case when when a political leader goes into a different cultural political context and wins or convinces through personal magnetism. And currently there is barely anything written on charm. There is on, of course, charisma and Weber and so on. Some on personal magnetism. There are business books on how to be charming in 10 steps when you're negotiating, and dating advice for women from the 1930s on how to be charming. But that's about all so far. So I'm looking for good case studies. The nuclear deal one I chose because of the very rational context in which it occurs.
I just add one footnote. Among all the reception research we did for this book, my least interesting focus groups and interviews were with my neighbors in Berkeley, because nothing was hidden from them, and they knew it all, and they were critical about everything.
So, I was a newspaper reporter and an editor for 10 years, and so one of the things you learn in the newsroom is that there's really no pattern to anything. Everything that appears often is just totally haphazard and serendipitous because the reporter came across something or, whatever. So I'm sort of wondering, when you're looking and when you're analyzing the news content, if you're taking into account, I guess, does it appear from outside that everything is systemic and there's systemic decisions being made, or does it appear from outside the way it feels from the inside, which is that much of what happens is just totally random and things appear because of, there's systems that are directing, your editors and so on, but a lot of it is just sort of coming up from the ground that reporters hear about or they come across or whatever. So I'm wondering how you capture that, if in fact there hasn't been that much talking to reporters that much, or being in the newsroom to look at the production of it, because it's often not an organized process.
A short answer to that is, I've talked to some, focusing on the question of the move from a more transcript-like version of news and to a more analytical version of news. That when I have talked to some people at the New York Times who were there at the times in the years where this transition was happening, they talk about how it was all the influence of a specific editor. Max Frankel's name comes up, and there are a couple of others at the Times. And that's how they experienced it. It wasn't random, it was all about an individual editor exercising his will and influence. But the same thing happened all over the world, actually, at almost exactly the same time. It could have been that Max Frankel was the model for Swedish public television, where the same thing happened at the same time. I doubt it. It could be. There are, journalists are connected. There is an international community. But so I just, it may look from the cutting room floor like this is sort of random, but nonetheless, I think there's some kind of national or global or large scale forces at work.
I can answer it with the fall of the Berlin Wall coverage, where I interviewed journalists, and it looks at American, West German, East German, and Soviet coverage of the event. And what was interesting that, of course, you are dealing here with a random event itself, so it is a complicated case because the event itself emerged as very random and haphazard and accidental. But it was striking that the journalists themselves were the proudest of moments of randomness in some ways in their coverage. So they were proud of overcoming situations that are random, that are emerging. So the heroic narrative was how do we solve a very chaotic situation in the newsroom, and we suddenly have to react to an event and go out. And so it was interesting to see how randomness was part of the heroic narrative and the power of journalists, and presented it continuously as you say, as the standard feature being a journalist. You deal with randomness and uncertainty in the newsroom and outside of the newsroom, and you try to tame it in some way or another.
So, Rosma.
Yes. Thank you very much for those three. For these three fabulous papers, really. That was interesting also in the juxtapositions. Okay, I'll try again. Okay, it's just me. I only have actually. I was thinking of this question about charm and whom else you could include in your study. And the interesting thing is you could include Trump. Really, because he could either be a divine case from which you find out what charm is about, but he could also turn out to be charming. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about, for me, that the way Trump is being depicted in Germany or in the German media, he seems to be very, I mean, he has an ugly face and he is depicted as really uncharming. The opposite of charming, I don't know what that would be, really. No, but it could be interesting, really. That was just it had crossed my mind even before you said we should tell you.
Oh, that's a great suggestion. I mean, one type of, so that could be one way of looking at it. So there are certain successful cases of constructing charm. There are others in which you create anti-charm. But then there is also the case when we have political leaders with whom, we may or may not sympathize with, but who do have charming qualities for certain people. And, if you ask Trump voters, probably that, quite a lot of them would claim that. Same is true about Netanyahu, who doesn't have the delicate charm that Zarif has. Zarif's name, by the way, in Persian means delicate, so it's even, the symbolism of that. But there is kind of a bold type of joking charm that people who are close to him claim that is there. Similar is true about Viktor Orban in Hungary, who, very controversial.
Thanks.
I don't know whether it's good or if I speak on that or just wrong. Yeah, I mean,
he's very charming. Everybody says he's very charming. Oh, you don't see it on the outside.
Her mediated construction is not exactly about charm, I would say, yeah.
So as I call in the next person, I would say that, in all of our interviews with health journalists, I should say that there was one public figure who they saw as being particularly charming, but I won't name him because otherwise I might embarrass someone within the room. But, so Nick, I think yours was the next question.
I just wanted to go back to Charles's question and replay it slightly different, but it's a question maybe back to Charles in a sense, that all these three papers have emphasised the complexity. All the papers emphasise the complexity of the inputs to the media system one way or the other, particularly very vividly in relation to linguistics. But on the other hand, and you said how much complexity do we need? It's just endlessly. Just need to switch the sound system.
If you could repeat it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a real question how much complexity we need, because we could just go on finding more and more layers of reality endlessly. But that's obviously not really what motivates any of us to do any analysis. But it seems, so the question is then what brings that seeking of complexity to a halt? And it's striking that there's one term we've had in the past 2 hours which we haven't picked up on, but of course it's the classic anthropological term of ritual. So this checks isn't in your index. So I'm very interested. But ritual is of course about the very, very complex production of radical simplifications, myths of work to stitch a simplified account onto a society so that it works reliably and so on. So, and the previous paper this morning was all about that. It was all about the violence that's done through language, through images, through the mind. So we can't really avoid that confrontation. So I'd like to, moving out from Julia's figure, going back to the old, for us, classic polarity between transmission and ritual, which is obviously absurd because obviously transmission is not transmission anymore. It's an endless circle. That's ridiculous. But ritual is important. Radical simplifications are very important still. So how do we think about that in the light of the massive complexity that you brought to our understanding of circulation? I mean, it's partly aimed at you and reflecting back on how all these animals reflect back on the book. Which, as I admitted yesterday, I hadn't had the chance to read, but I'm now gradually reading. I think that's a very interesting question, which is coming out of this panel very different. Totally different emphasis. So how do we resolve those differences in terms of what you offer in the book? So it might be for you to answer, Julia, reflecting on which one happens.
I mean, for me, with the Stories Without Borders book, the central claim of the book is the power of simplification and condensation. And I ran into a lot of opposition when I'm presenting the book in that sense, because the quick answer to that is this is media distortion. The same way as you discussed in the intro yesterday, that there is immediately a critical framework put on it, that what we are seeing here, in case of the coverage of events, is the international media coming in, global media cannibalizing local memory, and so on. And the strong critical take on the practices of simplification, universalization, or condensation. And I find that very strange because, I haven't seen that in human-to-human communication to condense. That's how we interact in everyday life, and that's how media representations work. And what I usually say to that is an answer. So, to put it in a radical way, you have a confusing, contradictory event that in all its complexity, nobody would remember. So you have that chance of telling it with all its complexity, details, factual details, and so on, and it wouldn't last, and new generations wouldn't recall it because they wouldn't connect with. Or you have a chance to condense it, simplify it, package it, spread it in such a way, and it becomes an event that may influence later public debates even a century later. So which one do you pick?
So maybe if I could jump in for a minute, since this was directed to me. This is a really interesting question. And of course, that's one thing that we really liked as we got deeper and deeper into looking at health news in terms of this broader process of mediatization, is that it defied almost all of the generalizations about journalism. What do you say about television? Just sound bites, dumbed down, stories with no complexity. So just look, if we could pick on him again, at many of Rich Besser's stories where he might present in the voice of a journalist some incredibly complex information. This is television, national network news, very complex information. And then actually move into the voice of a public health, thinking about public health perspectives on this story, and often ending in the voice of a clinician. Not only is this information tremendously complex, but these are three different voices and relationships to an audience in the space of maybe 2 minutes, define all of these sorts of generalizations. So I might say that what we found more, let alone a 2 full-page story in the New York Times. This is remarkable. This is like a mini book, right, with tremendous numbers of voices that are cited. And the information that, probably is as hard as some